But once you're here, like I said, particularly if you're here on a green card, when you're a permanent resident, then you get First Amendment rights. And yeah, we do protect people's right to say that America is an evil empire, and frankly, we should protect that.
After Mahmoud Khalil's arrest, the Trump administration said it would seek to deport more anti-Israel students, and that's exactly what the administration is doing. This week, 21-year-old Columbia student Yunseo Chung sued the Trump administration after officials reportedly tried to arrest and deport her. Chung is a legal permanent resident who's lived in the U.S. since she was 7, but she was arrested at a pro-Palestinian sit-in at Barnard last month. There are some process questions being raised once again here, according to reports. The administration seems to have mistaken Chung's legal status for a green card rather than legal permanent resident. Chung's lawyers are accusing the government of procuring warrants under false pretenses. More crucially, though, this raises the same question, fundamentally, as Khalil's arrest. Is this legal? Should it be? Is it hypocritical from free speech champions? The New York Times reports on other cases that popped up in recent days, writing the administration has, quote, sought the arrest of Mamadou Tall, a doctoral student in Africana Studies at Cornell University, and Ranjani Srinivasan, another Columbia University student who left the country for Canada after learning that her student visa had been revoked. Tall posted while applying for his visa, he hoped for the, quote, end of the U.S. empire, and after receiving it, quote, my hatred of the U.S. empire knows no bound. Just today, the Free Press reported that Columbia's quote-unquote cave to the Trump administration, which initially revoked $400 million in federal funding over the school's alleged failure to protect students and faculty from anti-Semitism, may not even be much of a cave at all. Columbia agreed to conditions outlined by the administration last week. Now, though, the Free Press writes, quote, in a private Zoom call over the weekend, interim Columbia president Katrina Armstrong told approximately 75 faculty members that, contrary to her public statements, the school has no plans to meet some key demands made by the Trump administration for Columbia to win back that $400 million worth of federal funding. According to a transcript of the call obtained by the Free Press, Armstrong promised that there would be, quote, no change to masking and, quote, no change to our admissions procedures, both of which the administration has demanded, according to the Free Press, which adds, what's more, Armstrong said the school would not put its Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies department under, quote, academic receivership for a minimum of 5 years, another Trump demand. She also told faculty members that discipline remains independent and has not been moved to my office as the Trump administration's anti-Semitism task force had insisted. The Free Press concludes this is in direct contradiction to Columbia's public promises to the White House. Now, the administration is investigating other schools as well, and I'm sure that leaked transcript isn't doing anybody any favors who may be falling into these inquiries. So for more on all of this, we turn now to Greg Lukianoff of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, a group that has been all over this, not just over the last month, but over the course of years. Greg's book, The Canceling of the American Mind, was co-authored with the wonderful Ricky Schlott. That is out in paperback on April 29th. That is a really timely release date. I definitely recommend the book, and I'm excited to try to work through some of this with Greg now, who, again, has been dealing with this, consistent on this for years. So, Greg, thank you so much for joining us. Have you noticed prices creeping up? I know you've noticed prices creeping up. Groceries, gas, everything's costing more. Tariffs are kicking in, markets are all over the place, and people are wondering, is your retirement built to handle this? Well, that's exactly why we've partnered with Augusta Precious Metals, because when the economy shifts, smart investors look for ways to protect what they've built, and historically gold has done just that, holding its value through inflation, recessions, and even financial crises. A gold IRA lets you own real physical gold inside your retirement account. More investors, especially those with at least $50,000 in retirement savings, are turning to this as a way to hedge against uncertainty. If you're curious about how it works, Augusta Precious Metals put together a free guide that breaks it all down. How gold IRAs work, why they're in demand, and whether they make sense for you. No cost, no catch, just information you can use. Click the link in the description and grab your copy today.
Thanks for having me.
We were talking before the recording started that you have been busy these days, and I just want to start by asking, seriously, so the Trump administration comes in on a free speech platform, but also telegraphing that they would do what they have been doing for the most part.
Yeah.
So, you've had a lot of work. You always do work for both the left and the right, and that's sort of the thing that sort of fires thing,
Yeah.
and it's amazing. Now, the Trump administration, was rightfully condemning a lot of free speech violations. A lot of people in the conservative movement were condemning free speech violations on campuses, for example, over the last decade. They come into office, and we're now seeing student deportations. We're seeing Columbia University's access to federal funding being threatened on ideological grounds. So could you just give us kind of a rundown of what you've been working on the last few weeks?
Oh my God, so busy. Now it's kind of funny to come to the defense of Colombia because few people in the country have been quite as critical of Colombia as I have been. um, I gave a talk about censorship in the sciences at a conference at USC, and I even said, if I was God King of Colombia, I'd declare it strictly a technological school from now on.
Mm.
Like I think like the situation there has gotten that bad. But but at the same time, a lot of the things that Trump administration is trying to pull it's not following the law, it's not following due process, it's not following the Constitution. And so we've been involved. We've criticized the Trump administration taking away the 400 million dollars from Colombia on vague ideas of illegal protests, which Trump stated, just on the idea that wow they're going to overcorrect here. They're going to start stamping out just regular protest, and we think that that's overall bad. I also am deeply troubled by the idea that a lot of these grants. I think that this was about 250 of that was from the NIH, and I'm like, I really don't like what Columbia tolerated for a long time when it came to, harassment of Jewish students, threats, disruption of the university, shout downs. I mean, it's not like the pro-Palestinian movement has been any friend to freedom of speech or academic freedom. But the idea that because the administration handled this so poorly, someone might stop doing cancer research has me a little troubled. And then, of course, we have the case of Mahmoud Khalil, which has been all over the news. This is a case where he was, arrested and deported in an attempt to sort of evade having a bad forum where this case would be heard. They tried to get him to Louisiana, but it ended up in New Jersey. And when the administration was initially talking about this, they were really primarily pointing to, things like flyers that were related to an organization that he was part of. Never actually saying that he himself handed these out. Um, and so it was interesting because like I kind of assumed the administration. Well, first they didn't seem to know that he was here on a green card, which means he's a permanent resident, as opposed to someone on a more trickier sort of student visa, which have a lot more conditions to it. I kind of thought that the administration would come out with some illegal behavior Khalil had been involved in, but day after day passed, and they never really made that argument. And they're basing the argument on a provision that allows the Secretary of State, in this case Marco Rubio, to deport people if they have an adverse consequence for foreign policy. And I really want to focus people on that, not necessarily just the Khalil case, because that is remarkable power, and so much power, so much vague and broad power, that the one time it's actually been considered in court, and this is actually a funny little tidbit. Donald Trump's late sister, who was a judge, said that this was unconstitutional pretty much any way you cut it. This is too much vague, broad power over everything from speech to due process that it can't all be vested in the Secretary of State. Unfortunately, that case was overturned for completely different reasons, and to our knowledge, that provision has never been tested before or since. But I think it's pretty compelling that the one time it actually has been considered, they said, no, this is just a flatly unconstitutional provision.
Mm. Okay, and on the Khalil case, the White House has claimed these posters, which it was like one of them literally was a Hamas propaganda piece. It said like Hamas Ministry of Communications, something to that extent, on the poster. That Khalil, because he was a leader of the student protest movement and those posters were handed out in an event, somehow had a relationship with that particular poster and was assisting Hamas, was providing some type of material support for
Yeah.
Hamas, which is, popular legal construction. So what is the credibility of those claims in this case, Greg?
Not strong based on that fact. Like if they have better facts, and maybe they'll introduce them at some point, but they haven't so far yet. So material support has a very kind of specific meaning, thanks to a Supreme case called Holder. Now, obvious material support is sending money or weapons to a designated terrorist group. That's a crime. And that's a very serious crime, in fact. But in the Holder case, and it's something that it's not a case well liked by a lot of First Amendment scholars. I actually think the conclusion is fairly reasonable. That essentially this was a group that was working with, was it the PKK in Turkey? They were actually, they were having meetings with them. They were doing trainings with them. In this case, they were doing trainings with them on like how to do better PR, essentially. But you're still like literally working with the PKK, and like, no, we can punish that. They haven't made an allegation that anything like that has happened, with Mahmoud Khalil, and if they do, that's an entirely different case. So they're using the term material support. There's every so often it comes up in discussion. They haven't shown anything that looks anything like what the definition of material support would be. And of course, again, if they show it, then this is a different case. But they haven't yet.
Right. Yeah, we just haven't seen it yet. If it exists, they haven't
Yeah,
come forward.
I think given how much flack they've been taking for this, that they would have spent a lot of time digging stuff up. And in the most recent filing, one of the things they brought up was the claim that Khalil omitted certain previous employment in his visa application
Yes.
and his green card application. One was that he was a member of a Columbia student group, which he can be like that seemed a little bit weird. Oh, another weird one was that he was a member of UNWRA.
Yeah.
And I just really want to understand what they mean by that, because I don't know how exactly you're a member of it. And then the last one is that he worked at the British consulate in Beirut. And the question is that sufficient to get someone deported? As a general matter, when it comes to immigration law, and I have to, since I'm a First Amendment lawyer, and this certainly intersects with immigration, but we talked to some immigration lawyers about this, and they said generally the standard is it has to be material, and it has to be knowing. So that's going to be the big question in this case from a legal standard. But again, I really want to get people focused back on the vast power that Rubio is given in this case. The Secretary of State is given in this case,
Right.
and the fact that they opened essentially with the idea that this is about his speech, because there is some ambiguity in the law, to be clear, but there is very definite Supreme Court precedent saying resident aliens have free speech rights. People debate about how extensive those are, is part of the debate, but the fact that they have them is really not in question.
The way the law is written to delegate this power to the Secretary of State, I'm wondering, Greg, if you anticipate that some of these lawsuits could actually end up overturning that law itself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the only one that's been done so far overturned the law. It said this is too vague, this is too broad, and fires. We're obviously very idealistic, but we also try to be pragmatic at the same time. We get that that immigration will make subjective decisions on letting someone into the country in the first place, but once they're here, we believe they should have the same First Amendment rights as the student in the same protest standing right next to them. Partially because we think the law is pretty strong on that. Not definitive, but strong. But when it comes to the literal scenario that you have, I think Barry Weiss was joking that you had someone at a protest and all these other Colombian nepo babies are handing out the same vaguely pro Hamas flyers. Like they're completely protected, but one person in the protest is here on a green card, and they get kicked out. And I always make the comparison to the popularity of supporting the Irish Republican Army. Like when I was a kid in very sort of like Irish suburbs of New York, and the idea of like someone protesting for that, no matter how you might feel about it, the idea of someone being here on an Irish on an Irish student visa, being immediately deported for what every other student allowed him was around to do is not who we like to think we are.
And often, such a serious threat to free speech just comes in the way that the government or others, outside groups, will define, quote, anti Semitism, which is obviously a scourge and a very serious problem. What have you
Absolutely.
seen from the way the Trump administration? I mean, we've seen the right embrace, not surprisingly, but in the era of the right's sort of championing of free speech, we've seen pretty consistent embrace of very broad definitions of anti-Semitism from Republicans in recent years. It seems to be the case that that's what's happening now when it comes to how they approach Colombia. Is that what
Yeah.
you've seen, Greg?
Yeah, one of the things we're most concerned about, because Colombia basically caved to all the demands that
Right.
the Trump administration was making. They're now internally claiming that they didn't really quite do that, but I mean, certainly looks like they did to us. And they adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Act definition of anti-Semitism. Now, I try to be really clear on this. I have been saying that there's an anti Semitism problem in elite higher education and also particularly in schools in California for a long time. It's more than 10 years that I've been saying this, and I'm not Jewish, but it's just clear to me. And we at Fire have recommended a way of rewriting the law to make it really clear that these same protections that say like a black student gets
Hmm.
to protect them from discrimination would actually also apply to Jewish students. And we also think this would be perfectly constitutional and should be done given there is anti-Semitism and there has been harassment for sure. But instead, the government seems really wed to this idea of including the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which every First Amendment person has issues with because it lists actual opinions about Israel. It's like saying that Israel is an apartheid state. I don't, that's not something I would say. But at the same time, is that protected speech?
Yeah.
No question. And I've always been kind of puzzled. Like, why are you so wed to having the IHRA definition in there when it actually gives your law a constitutional vulnerability?
Mm.
Like it seems like you could just achieve this just by focusing on patterns of discriminatory behavior, which harassment is supposed to be. So we were troubled by that. I'm also really fascinated by fascinated in a dark way, with the idea that they were told to put like the Middle Eastern Studies Department into receivership, and they figured out some way to kind of meet the government there. But I've never seen. I know that there have been departments that have been placed in receivership in the past. I've never seen it mandated from essentially the White House.
Mm.
We're pretty troubled about what the government's been pulling here, even if I don't have a great deal of sympathy for Colombia at the same time.
Yeah. And, Columbia is not the only school that is now dealing with this. There's the case of Cornell graduate student Mamadou Tall, who's a sort of interesting case because I don't know if you've seen this. He was on Twitter, or I guess X now, talking about how he hates the U.S. empire and U.S. empire, blah, 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 and was given then a visa to come in and study in the United States. And it seems to me that they've not shown Khalil was in a similar situation, that he has said anything similarly that would like even be on that level. And I imagine, Greg, you even object to that level being something the government objects to after giving the student a visa. I'm curious what you would make of the argument from the Trump administration. Is like, why would you ever give, just in a general sense, why would you ever give a visa to someone who says they're hoping for the end of the U.S. empire? Like, what country would do that and bring someone in to study there? I don't know. I'm just that genuinely is sort of, as a free speech person, that does give me pause.
Yeah, and I take the argument seriously. My dad came here as a Russian refugee, and my point has been on this, like the idea that they're not going to look at him subjectively on admitting him in the first place. Of course they're going to. Like, and I would be really mad if my dad, who loves America and hated the Bolsheviks, was lost a slot to someone who's saying death to America. I love the Bolsheviks. We need to overturn. So I'm realistic on the idea that once coming in here, that's a subjective analysis to some degree. But once you're here, like I said, particularly if you're here on a green card, when you're a permanent resident, then you get First Amendment rights. And yeah, we do protect people's right to say that America is an evil empire. And frankly, we should protect that. So I get the criticism of immigration. I also get the criticism of places like Colombia, who seem to want to give special favoritism to activists in general. as I think an activist mindset is a certainty mindset, and you should be actually trying to admit more people with a scholarly mindset, which is
Mm.
much more. I don't actually have my mind made up on everything. If I'm coming here to study the following things, I take seriously the possibility I might be wrong. So it's interesting to be in the position of saying that attempts to sort of reform higher ed are going too far, not following the rules, when I think higher ed reform really badly needs to happen. But you do have to follow the rules.
So we talked about the Cornell student. There are, I believe, two more students just from Columbia who have been swept up into this. Ranjani Srinivasan and another. There's Yunseo Chung, also from Columbia. How far do you think this will go, Greg?
Oh, I think it's going to go really far. I mean, I saw a couple where they deported someone whose visa had expired, and I'm like, well, like they're gonna be able to do that, like that. But in other cases, there was one where someone was arrested for a protest. She was here on a green card since I think she was 7, though.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, like kind of her whole
Chung.
life has
Yeah.
been in the U.S., and they're deporting her on the basis of her arrest for protest. That gets you more into probably can but should
Mm-hmm.
kind of territory.
Mm.
So I'll be interested to see what happens in that case.
Okay, so the can but should formulation I think is very important here, Greg, because it's like that was an argument. I'm really curious for your take on this. That was an
Yeah.
argument that the right found itself making all of the time when private companies, and in
Oh
some
yeah.
cases public schools, would punish conservative speech or suppress conservative speech or hound conservative speech over the last 10 years.
Yeah, no, I wrote a book called actually, by the way, my paperback edition of my book with the great Ricky Schlott is coming out April 29th on cancel culture. And yeah, I am critical of people being fired for even at a private company for speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. I try to actually use some of the logic of the case law. Now, of course, they would argue back saying, yeah, but that doesn't count for when you actually break the law. And that's going to be like the major factor in that particular case. But then you really just have to argue, like someone who was arrested for protest, does that really mean she deserves deportation from the country that she's kind of the only one she's ever known?
Mm. Well, and finally, Greg, some of the Trump administration's actions so far, especially as it relates to DEI, have been beneficial, have opened up avenues for
Yep.
speech that were previously challenged, to say the very least. So, how do you assess? I mean, as somebody who works in this space, who's dedicated their life to this space, looking back on the last couple of months, how do you assess what you've seen from the Trump administration so far?
We try so hard to be as nonpartisan as is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And like we actually try. We are an organization that makes a point of hiring people across the political spectrum on purpose because we think it keeps us honest.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the Trump administration came in, and we tried to give credit where credit is due, we actually thought the J.D. Vance's take on AI was actually very pro free speech. We thought what he said about censorship in Europe was right on. I was also would have liked him to throw in some criticism of censorship in Russia, but like in Europe, he was right on. Getting rid of some of the DEI stuff, I don't think people understand how much DEI has been kind of the orthodoxy police in higher ed, and has been a threat to freedom of speech. But in the more recent months, like some of the stuff that they're doing to some of the law firms, for example, saying that they, Covington and Burling and Perkins Coe and Paul Weiss, it worries me to a great degree, and I'm worried it's going to get worse. Now, also, by the way, we're representing Ann Selzer, a pollster who got a poll very wrong. She was a well-known, well-regarded pollster, and she found that that Harris was like 2 points ahead in Iowa. She was way off though, and she owned the problem. She was like, "Wow, okay." And she used older methods of doing like phone calls, and she realized her methodology, just didn't work anymore. And she was embarrassed by it. She actually retired after making that big mistake, after having like such a great reputation as a pollster. Well, Trump is personally suing her
Mm-hmm.
on the basis of a consumer protection law that says essentially saying that this was fraud on the part of Selzer. And so we're fighting this. But does that, given the behavior towards some of the law firms, does that make me a little bit worried in a way that I've never been worried about a previous administration, where it can become very, very personal and very directed very fast? Yeah, I'm a little worried.
And there's
Not going to
nobody
stop us, but but I'm worried.
nobody's less sympathetic than lawyers, Greg, as you know. Greg Lukianoff, thank you so much for breaking all of this down. I know you're busy, so we appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. You get a weekly newsletter from me, you get an email address to talk to us, and you get paywalled episodes of the show, most importantly. So make sure to head over to undercurrents.tv for that. As I think about all of these things, it sort of does remind me, what Greg was saying about due process reminds me of the same conversation we're having about immigration right now in a couple of different ways. One of which is that in some of these cases, the Biden administration actually invited people to apply for asylum and allowed them to come into the United States and not be detained while their trials were pending. And it seems as though the Trump administration is deporting people who the United States, under Biden, promised to put into trials. So again, is there a question of whether it's legal? Absolutely. That's also a question of whether you should then just completely revoke a process that the United States, because of the horrible policies of the former president, actually invited all of these people to make like really arduous, awful journeys coming up through Central America into Mexico. Every single one of them was paid. Every single one of them was trafficked by cartels, and are now here in the United States. They risked all of that on the promise of the Biden administration. So you know, the legality is one thing, the morality is another thing. But even on the legality question, you know, when you've promised this process and are deporting without the process playing out, gets into some of that too. And it's sort of to me, it's sort of a similar thing. But I have a hard time, like with the case of Mamadou Tall. We actually interviewed him on Breaking Points back in the fall. And I remember I asked, you know, a lot of your detractors would say, why are you even here if you hate the U.S. empire so much? And his answer, I went back and looked at it, was essentially, I have a right to be here. It didn't answer, you know, well, here's why I want to come to the United States, because the opportunities are so good. It was just, I have a right to be here, which is, I mean, if you have a visa, if you have a student visa, yes, you do have a right to be here, but it sidesteps the question of actually like why you would want to be here. And I'm genuinely curious about that. If you're somebody who believes the U.S. empire needs to end, if you believe the U.S. empire is fundamentally a bad thing, and is your enemy, then I guess I wonder why someone would want to come over here, if not to thwart it. And if you then admit that you're here to thwart it, why would the administration, you know, not deport someone who's here to undermine it, or who's here to undermine the United States? Now, again, these visas were already given. So revoking them, there's the legal question, there's a moral question. And so I like actually Greg's formulation where he said there's the can question and then there's the should question. And as sympathetic as I am to like criticisms of why some of these visas were ever given, the question then of what to do with people when they're already here is significant, both legally and morally, and it's very thorny, and it's a tough one because my sympathies are always with free speech or always with due process, but it's really hard to always, it's hard to look at different cases that aren't as clear cut. And figure out which principle is winning out. But no, I think Greg is right on with his assessments that he just shared. And, it's always, Fire's consistency is always appreciated. And I knew he'd be a good person to talk to. So thank you for tuning in, and we will be back with more Undercurrents soon.